Well, an escalator to the top. How swank. Must be a yacht club.
Welcome to Into the Vault, the movie review series where I dive into the good, the bad, and the bizarre corners of the Disney film empire, one randomly chosen title at a time. And this time, the randomizer didn't just pick a movie, it handed me something that feels less like a film and more like a live action cartoon gone off the rails. Mr. Magoo, a name that might spark nostalgia for classic animation fans and confusion for everyone else. The 1997 live action adaptation of the nearsighted animated character first introduced in the 1940s, this time brought to life quite literally by slapstick legend Leslie Nielsen. It was distributed by Walt Disney Pictures, which means thanks to the sprawling Disney library, it counts whether I like it or not. The character himself has a surprisingly long history. Mr. Magoo first appeared in 1949 in the theatrical short The Ragtime Bear, created by John Hubley for United Productions of America. Voiced by Jim Backus, Magoo became famous for his stubborn personality, his oblivious nearsightedness, and the trail of accidents that followed him wherever he went. During the 1950s and 60s, Mr. Magoo was a fixture in animated shorts and television, earning 2 Academy Awards for Best Animated Short. His popularity led to a string of TV series, including The Mr. Magoo Show and The Famous Adventures of Mr. Magoo, where he was reimagined in various roles, often hilariously oblivious to the mishaps unfolding around him. In the 1970s and 80s, Magoo made appearances in holiday specials like Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, which became a cult favorite and is still remembered as one of the first animated Christmas specials for television. These productions kept him in public eye even as his styles of humor aged. By the 1990s, nostalgia for classic characters spurred studios to revisit old properties. Disney, holding the rights through its acquisition of certain UPA works, decided to bring Magoo to the big screen in live action form, an ambitious move that would end up being far more infamous than successful. This is a film stuffed with pratfalls, jewel heists, awkward 90s humor, and more how did this get made moments than I can count. Upon release, critics panned Mr. Magoo for its dated jokes and clumsy execution. It holds a dismal 9% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it flopped at the box office, grossing just $28.9 million worldwide against a budget of around $30 million. These numbers cemented its place as one of Disney's more questionable live action experiments of the era. The trouble didn't stop there. The film was rushed to video after protests by blind people and their advocates across the US raised concerns about its offensive portrayal. Disney attempted to deflect the backlash by including a disclaimer at the end, insisting the film was not intended as an accurate depiction of the visually impaired. Critic Roger Ebert dryly noted that this was only funny moment in the whole movie. The controversy even extended overseas. The British Federation of the Blind petitioned the British Board of Film Classification to ban the movie in the UK, arguing it would bring ridicule upon blind and partially sighted people. So grab your binoculars, or maybe you might need a full on telescope, because we're going to need all the help we can get to see our way through this one. The movie opens with an animated sequence featuring the original Mr. Magoo, and honestly, it's a clever way to start. It pays homage to where the character came from while also introducing kids at the time to the fact that Mr. Magoo was originally a cartoon. Naturally, the gag revolves around his nearsightedness. He strolls out of a window thinking it's an elevator, brushes past a few other hazards, and somehow stumbles through unscathed. It sets the tone right away. Magoo may be blind to the world around him, but the world always seems to bend just enough to let him slip by. The movie then shifts into live action, where we meet Mr. Magoo, played by Leslie Nielsen, arriving at the dedication of a new wing of the museum. The big draw of the evening is an exhibit featuring treasures of Kuristan, with the crown jewel literally being the Star of Kuristan. Naturally, this calls for a fancy gala, because you can't unveil a priceless artifact without a crowd of wealthy donors eager to sip champagne and show off. It's here we get our first groan-worthy nearsighted gag. Magoo mistakes a decorative piece of fruit on a woman's hat for hors d'oeuvres, and casually takes a bite. He's joined by his nephew Waldo, who urges him to see a new eye doctor. The doctor he currently has is ancient and only keeps Magoo around as a patient because all his others have passed away. It's a dark little joke, but played off quickly. Meanwhile, Waldo spots a woman he's instantly smitten with, Stacy Sampanahoditra, representing the Kuristan Foreign Office. Tongue-tied and flustered, Waldo struggles to get a word out. Magoo, oblivious as ever, jumps in and suggests Waldo invite her to the opera the following night. To Waldo's delight and shock, Stacy actually agrees. We then move to the dedication ceremony for the new wing of the museum, where Magoo is giving a speech as the benefactor. He's handed the ceremonial scissors to cut the ribbon, and in true Mr. Magoo fashion, nearly takes out the guests instead. Instead of cutting the ribbon, he slices through the wires for the spotlight and cameras. Sparks fly everywhere, which Magoo interprets as celebratory fireworks for his big moment. Say what you will about the jokes, but Leslie Nielsen nails the mannerisms and vocal inflections of the original Magoo. He generally sounds like the character brought to life. Unfortunately, this means we're in for plenty more sight gag comedy. As the lights go out from the cut wires, Magoo wanders aimlessly through the darkness, stumbles into the Egyptian exhibit, and strikes up a conversation with a mummy he believes is a living person. Seconds later, he inevitably winds up inside a sarcophagus because, of course, he does. We then cut to the roof where two bandits, a man and a woman, are preparing to steal something. Shocker, it's the Star of Kuristan. Cue the stereotypical heist sequence where the bungee through the roof while the security guard ignores the monitors, conveniently missing the woman cutting the feed. Another guard strolls through the exhibit, somehow oblivious to the woman perched on top of a giant pterodactyl. She makes her way to the jewel while her partner lowers himself into the museum with far less grace. He tumbles, screams, and smacks into multiple exhibits, sliding down a brontosaurus before crashing headfirst through the glass case protecting the star. Only then do the alarms finally sound. We're barely 10 minutes in, and the movie has already exhausted its physical comedy quota. The thief grabs the jewel while Magoo is still hanging out with the mummy, blissfully unaware it's not alive. The man decides to take care of Magoo and immediately escalates to pulling a gun, because apparently tying up an old man wasn't an option. Luckily, a guard spots him and orders him to freeze. Magoo stumbles out through an emergency exit, distracting the guard long enough for the bandit to land a punch. And because Slapstick never takes a break, both the thief and the guard are soon flattened by the falling pterodactyl. The next morning, we meet Mr. Magoo's dog Angus, who wakes up surrounded by some truly questionable kids' movie humor. Like, he has a framed picture of a dog in rabbit ears and underwear, because apparently every family film needs a stray Playboy gag. Angus even uses a bedpan before bounding off to wake up his owner. He dutifully lays out Magoo's clothes, setting the stage for what looks like a fishing trip. Meanwhile, Waldo is outside polishing his car to a blinding shine, and it makes me wonder, what's his angle here? Is he hoping to land a hefty inheritance someday, or is he just that desperate for Magoo's approval? Either way, Magoo compliments him on how spotless the windshield looks, though from Magoo's perspective, we see he can barely make out anything at all. Back at the museum, Stacy and the staff are assessing the damage. One official casually suggests they could just display a replica of the jewel and no one would notice, because apparently fooling the public is plan A. The two men with Stacy turn out to be government agents, Stupak from the CIA and Anders from the FBI, and the scene quickly sets up a turf war over which agency is actually in charge. We are then properly introduced to the two bandits, Luann and Morgan, who naturally just so happen to be on the same lake where Magoo is fishing. Cue yet another vision gag. Instead of sunscreen, Magoo smears toothpaste all over himself. At this point, the jokes about Magoo being blind are starting to feel pretty old. Meanwhile, Luann floats the idea of double-crossing Morgan's boss, Cloquet, and selling the jewel themselves. That way they keep all the money. Their banter quickly drifts into humor that feels widely out of place for a kids' movie. She purrs that with the money she can take him places he's never been, to which he deadpans that he's never been to Toronto. She follows it up with a wink about knowing a bed and breakfast in Toronto, minus the breakfast. They lean in for a kiss, but it's all a setup. Luann starts kicking Morgan. He grabs her leg, and the two nearly topple overboard, dropping the jewel straight onto Magoo's head because, of course, just keeping it in a secure place would have been far too much sense. Magoo, blissfully unaware, manages to hook Morgan with his fishing rod and reels him in, pants and all. As Mr. Magoo packs up, the jewel ends up in his tackle box. We get yet another sight gag. This time he mistakes a water wheel for an escalator. Meanwhile, Morgan trails him the entire time, still in his underwear and definitely not sharing in Magoo's dumb luck. At this point, the repetition is starting to wear thin. Back at the museum, the authorities conclude that Magoo staged a diversion so his supposed accomplices could steal the jewel. Stacy isn't convinced and she insists she's going to the opera with him that evening. The agents see that as an opportunity to suggest she act as their inside person. We're then introduced to Claquette, the mastermind behind the operation. He grumbles that hiring Luann was a mistake, though he admits she was the only one skilled enough to actually pull off the heist. In true villain fashion, he orders Morgan to get the jewel back and to get rid of Luann in the process. Stacy arrives at Magoo's house for the opera. Magoo, ever the awkward host, tells Waldo to show her the garden because it's intimate. Meanwhile, Angus trots up with the jewel in his mouth. Magoo, thinking it's just another game of fetch, casually tosses it into the garden, where it promptly gets lodged in one of the topiaries. This is when we learn that Magoo isn't just attending the opera, he's in the opera. He chats with a reporter named Prunella, who is very obviously Luann in disguise. Angus, of course, sees through her immediately, because you should always trust the dog. The opera begins and Magoo bumbles his way backstage to get ready. Magoo tries to get ready backstage, and in the process, he accidentally clocks Stupak, who is tailing him, with a giant hammer. Meanwhile, Morgan sneaks around in costume, still hoping to steal back the jewel. He shadows Magoo only to also get smacked by the hammer, and then accidentally switch on a giant fan that sends the performance into chaos. We now see Magoo and Luann, still disguised as Prunella, on the beach as she interviews him, or at least pretends to. She flatters him with softball questions, but when she tosses her notepad aside, Stupak picks it up and realizes it's completely blank. Clearly, she's no real reporter. Magoo, blissfully unaware, muses that something precious should always be kept in sight. Luann pounces, asking if he means a jewel. He agrees, but rambles about a metaphorical jewel close to the heart, not realizing she's fishing for the Star of Kuristan. When she presses to know where he keeps it, he insists it's close to his heart. Luann ups the ante, demanding a kiss and suggests they slip away to a private boat. When Magoo leans in, though, she swaps herself out and ends up planting one on a fish instead. On the boat, Luann frantically tosses items overboard, desperately searching for the jewel. She asks where Magoo keeps his tackle box, and he casually mentions it's back at his house. Thinking quickly, she fakes a sprained ankle and says she could recover at his place, setting up her excuse to tag along and snoop further. Stupak and Anders show up at Magoo's house in disguise, and wouldn't you know it, Morgan is there too. In the commotion, Morgan knocks the jewel loose from the topiary it was stuck in earlier, but doesn't even notice. With the door locked, he attempts to crawl through the doggy door, squeezing through but losing his pants in the process. At this point, it's becoming a running gag. Morgan spends more time without pants than with them. Meanwhile, Stupak sneaks around planting hidden microphones until Anders warns him that Magoo is coming back. In a surprisingly clever bit, Stupak hides inside a jacket hanging in the hall closet. Luann plays the part of guest, asking Magoo to cook something while she pokes around the house. She eventually finds the tackle box, but of course, the jewel isn't inside. Morgan spots Stupak and bolts while Stupak notices Luann and races upstairs. Honestly, this sequence works pretty well. It's funny round of everyone scrambling for the jewel while Magoo stays blissfully unaware. Meanwhile, Angus finally gets hold of the jewel and tries to bring it to Magoo, who naturally assumes the dog wants to play. In the kitchen, Magoo is following a cooking show for instructions, but when Angus accidentally changes the channel to an exercise program, Magoo starts working out with the uncooked chicken in hand. It's ridiculous, but admittedly one of the funnier gags in the whole movie. This channel flips again to a hardware show, and suddenly Magoo is sanding away and even attempts to use a screwdriver on the chicken. Waldo arrives and tells Magoo that they need to talk. Magoo insists he has to meet Prunella, and while he wanders off, Waldo spots Angus with the jewel. He jumps to the conclusion that his uncle really did steal it. Luann tries to coax Magoo into handing her the jewel, but Angus bounds in with it, and Magoo, thinking it's still a game of fetch, tosses it toward the fireplace. Right on cue, Morgan pops out of the chimney, snatches the jewel, and reveals himself. Luann pulls a gun on him, but Waldo tackles her to stop her from firing, giving Morgan just enough time to escape. Luann tells Waldo that she's FBI and Morgan just stole the Star of Kuristan. Morgan makes off with Magoo's car, and they pile into the eggplant mobile to give chase. Naturally, Anders and Stupak manage to bumble into the road and nearly get ran over. What follows is a wild car chase that puts away too many lives at risk for what is essentially a comedy. They're only stopped when Magoo drives the eggplant mobile straight off a cliff, only to land perfectly inside a giant construction tube, roll through it, and then bounce onto a semi transporting cars. Because physics, I guess. During the aftermath, Luann spins another lie, claiming she's an undercover agent and explaining that Morgan is planning to sell the jewel that night at the ski lodge auction. Anders and Stupak meet up with Stacy and finally put the pieces together. Prunella is actually Luann. They decide to head to the auction to recover the jewel. Stacy wants in, but they brush her off, insisting it's a job for professionals. Her comeback? Then why are you two going? Honestly, that was one of the funnier lines in the whole movie. At the ski lodge, Morgan gathers a group of criminals to prepare for the auction. Among them is a surprising new arrival, Mr. Magoo himself disguised as Ortega Peru, also known as the Piranha, one of the most notorious criminals. Meanwhile, Waldo, Angus, and Luann are staking out the ski lodge. Luann abruptly ditches them, hopping on a snowmobile and racing off to the lodge. She sneaks inside just as Cloquet arrives and dramatically thanks everyone for coming to the auction. The auction is being held in the lodge's bathhouse and sauna, because clearly that's the most logical place to sell a priceless artifact. Cloquet dramatically presents the Star of Kyrgyzstan and instructs everyone to write down their opening bids. Magoo insists on getting a closer look at the jewel, which tips Cloquet off that he's an imposter. None other than Mr. Magoo in disguise. One of the glamorous women at the auction is revealed to be Luann, once again in disguise. Seriously, where is she storing all of those wigs? And she demands Magoo hand over the jewel. Cloquet tries to intervene, but she promptly knocks him flat. Waldo and Angus arrive at the lodge and spot Magoo talking with Luann. Waldo rushes in, trying to convince him that Luann isn't a federal agent at all, but a thief. Luann finally drops the axe, napping that she's never cared about him, demands the jewel. Before things escalate further, Morgan barges in and picks a fight with her, only to be drop-kicked into the pool. Magoo suggests they chase after her, but Waldo points out it might be easier if he actually put some clothes on first. Just then, the FBI and CIA arrive on the scene, ready to arrest Magoo instead. Luann takes off on a snowmobile, and Magoo chases after her on an upside-down ironing board he mistakes for a snowboard. Naturally, he barrels straight into the actual snowboard race because why not schedule a major criminal auction on the same day as the resort's big event? Morgan tries to keep up on skis but fares about as well as you would expect. Magoo eventually wipes out over the edge of a cliff, and just as the police finally catch up with Morgan, Waldo crashes into them, sending everyone tumbling over the cliff together. We then cut to a scene in Brazil where the real Ortega Peru is staying. Luann, disguised as an old woman, tells him the Star of Kyrgyzstan will be ready for him tomorrow. Waldo shows up asking about Luann, not realizing she's right in front of him. The hotel clerk quickly calls him out for not being a real bellhop and throws him out. Luann slips away and even passes right by Magoo without being noticed. Waldo reappears, saying they still don't know where she is, but Angus isn't fooled. The dog attacks her purse, ripping it open, and Luann bolts. On the ground, they discover an airport receipt with the name Prunella, which tips them off that the old woman was Luann all along and that she's prepared to fly to Brazil to meet Ortega Peru. They arrive in Brazil where Magoo sneaks into Peru's estate. Peru is preparing for his wedding and casually mentions that he and his bride are heading for Euro Disney, now called Disneyland Paris, for their honeymoon. Disney couldn't resist slipping in a cheap plug for their own brand. Peru also makes it clear that once they secure the jewel, Luann's usefulness will be over, and so will she. Magoo sneaks around and bumps into a mandrill, completely unaware it's an animal. Believing he stumbled onto a playground, he cheerfully starts explaining the plan to the mandrill, mistaking it for Waldo. The mandrill shrieks in response and promptly chases after them. They arrive at the wedding and spot Peru and Luann. Magoo tells Waldo to keep an eye on her while he goes after Peru. Peru and Luann meet to exchange the jewel for cash, but Peru's men quickly discover Waldo spying on them. Meanwhile, Magoo sneaks into the bridal suite, tumbles into the bathtub, and scares the actual bride into fainting. She collapses onto a tiger skin rug, and Magoo, ever confused, mistakes the rug's snarling face for hers. When Peru shows up, Magoo throws on the veil and pretends to be the bride, managing to keep him out of the room for the moment. Guess he's never heard of the old saying about not seeing the bride before the wedding. At the wedding, Peru presents his bride with the Star of Kyrgyzstan, only for Magoo to whip off the veil and reveal it's been him in disguise all along. He snatches the jewel and bolts with Peru's men hot on his heels. Magoo comes across Waldo tied up, and Peru offers him instructions on how to save him, but only if Magoo hands over the jewel first. Magoo, ever trusting, gives him the stone and demands his help, but of course Peru double-crosses him. Moments later, both Magoo and Waldo end up dangling precariously over the mandrill pit. The police show up with Anders and Stupak, and Angus helps Magoo rescue Waldo. Waldo spots Peru trying to escape. Stupak and Anders catch sight of Magoo sprinting in the wedding dress and quip that Peru could have done better than that. Realizing it's Magoo, they give chase. Luann leaps into a helicopter with Peru and forces him to take off. Magoo stumbles aboard too, and soon a chaotic fight breaks out midair as the helicopter swerves wildly. Shots are fired, Magoo bails out, and somehow splashes safely into the sea. Luann follows while the police continue chasing Peru in the helicopter. The authorities toss Magoo and Luann a raft, but she still demands the jewel. Magoo tells her she has the heart of an artichoke. The raft drifts towards the waterfall, but just in time, a line from the police officer pulls them to safety. Well, almost. Magoo manages to hook the line only to Luann, leaving himself headed straight over the falls. He plunges down, but the raft improbably balloons up and floats him gently to safety, right into a tourist raft where a guide has just finished telling the group about all the brides who are supposedly left to their deaths at these falls. Naturally, the tourists look up just in time to see Magoo plummeting down in a wedding dress. At this point, I was less laughing and more sighing. The movie keeps trying to top itself with bigger stunts, but it just ends up feeling tired and overdone. The helicopter lands with Luann and the authorities finally arrest her. Back at the museum, the star of Kuristan has returned and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. Stacy asks Waldo what's next for him, and he proudly announces he is now head of security for Magoo's company. Stacy decides to stay with him, and the two embrace as if this subplot was something we were all deeply invested in. Magoo wanders off, and the film closes with the return to animation as he bumbles into more trouble. And then, in perhaps the strangest ending note, the movie caps everything off with a disclaimer that I mentioned earlier, reminding us that this film does not accurately portray blindness or poor eyesight, just in case 2 hours of painfully obvious gags hadn't already made that clear. When all is said and done, the storyline here is as thin as it gets. It's less of a narrative and more of a string of pratfalls stitched together, with Magoo stumbling from one mishap to the next. That's fine for a 5-minute cartoon short, but stretched across a feature-length runtime, it gets exhausting pretty quickly. By the end, it feels like the movie has run out of ideas and just starts recycling the same gags over and over again. Magoo himself is another problem. Leslie Nielsen does his best, but the character never really works outside of the cartoon format. What was once a goofy exaggeration of nearsightedness now feels mean-spirited and uncomfortable, like the joke has aged about 4 decades too long. Instead of being charming, Magoo comes off as a danger to himself and everyone else. Waldo and Stacy's relationship doesn't help matters either. It's written in a way that feels shoehorned in. There's no real chemistry, and it feels like the script is just about going through the motions of giving the younger characters something to do. Their subplot could have been cut entirely and the movie wouldn't have lost a thing. Luann and Morgan, meanwhile, could have been fun as a pair of bumbling criminals, but they never quite land. Their back and forth double crossing feels more tedious than clever, and while Morgan has a couple of silly slapstick moments, including the running joke of him losing his pants, it's not frequent enough to feel like a real gag. Instead, it just comes off as another example of the film throwing jokes at the wall and hoping something sticks. And then there's the climax with Peru. Instead of building to a satisfying payoff, the final showdown feels flat and repetitive. Just another set of over the top stunts with nothing at stake. For a film that tries so hard to be zany and never manages to stick the landing. Overall, Mr. Magoo is the definition of a misfire. The story is weak, the characters are undercooked, and the comedy feels outdated. Disney clearly thought they could cash in on nostalgia and slapstick, but what they ended up with was a movie that nobody really wanted. Not critics, not audiences, and not even fans of the original cartoon. It's no wonder it bombed at the box office and sits at the bottom of Disney's live action experiments. And that's it for this nearsighted misadventure. So, what did the random picker land on next? Out of over 1,000 Disney owned titles, it gave me Trenchcoat from 1983, the oddball mystery comedy starring Margot Kidder and Robert Hayes, which blends espionage antics with screwball hijinks. This one promises it to be quite this tonal shift yet again. From misguided slapstick to Cold War farce, I'm curious to see whether it's an overlooked gem of early 80s Disney or another relic best left buried. Let's open the vault.